Hey guys, Josh with Gritr here with David Acosta Jr. With Allegiance Defense, Achilles Heel Tactical, and
AMTAC Shooting.
AMTAC Shooting, okay? He's covering all his bases here. So David and I have been chit-chatting for a little while, and finally we're here to this point. I don't know how long
It's been a minute.
Yeah, we've been trying to get this thing together. We weren't clicking. So finally we're here. Took one of his classes.
Yes.
And it was
recently.
fantastic. I am a huge proponent of training, as you guys know, so I'm always training myself, always trying to find new instructors, vet instructors, and just really trying to get some golden nuggets out of the 5 minutes that I'm in the class. Well, turns out his whole entire class was just one giant nugget, and I loved each and every second of it. So
thank you.
David's here, and we're going to talk a little bit about the importance of training.
Yeah.
To you in your field. First off, give a little background on yourself.
David Acosta, 42 years old, retired from professional law enforcement. I have a full-time gig working in executive protection, travel and teach for, again, Achilles Heel Tactical, AMTAC Shooting, myself, Allegiance Defense Solutions. Been traveling and teaching for a little bit now, past few years. Mm-hmm. Travel, teach, just a God-fearing, family-loving American man, like simple as that.
Absolutely. So, like we said, the importance of training. When did that training really start to make a difference for you in your field? When did you really start finding it crucial to really drill down and practice your craft?
Dude, so I grew up like doing martial arts. So I was always interested in martial arts. Like I always knew I was gonna be a cop. I loved the idea of being able to catch bad guys. And I was like, there's a job that lets you, like they pay you to do this? Yeah. That's cool. So I wanted to do that. I always knew like being able to fight would be important in relevance to that. So started training martial arts at a young age. Training was just always a thing, you know, like so growing up doing martial arts, getting into, athletics early on, like you learn early on that training is a critical component to being good at anything, So on the, like professionally, getting on the job, obviously with law enforcement, you have an academy training. Ours was like 7 months long back in 2004. I thought that was gonna be like, I was kind of new, like I didn't realize how that kind of works. Obviously there's some departments where they put like the absolute best dudes in the training side of the house. And there's other sides where that doesn't happen. And they're there despite their lack of experience and exposure. So I would say the catalyst for firearms training, for me at least, was I got into a critical incident a few years on the job. And that was 100% like the catalyst for firearms training. It's like, okay, I learned very quickly, you can't be fast or accurate enough, like, because you just don't know until you know, right? Like, you don't know until you either survive or don't. And the last thing you want to do is survive despite the fact you did it wrong. So I would say that incident was, without a like war story, so to say, that was definitely the catalyst to dive deeper into the firearms side of the house.
So with that being said, it's perfect. What do you say to people on the civilian side? They get their first firearm, they take an LTC class, and they go, cool, now I'm a professional, right?
Yeah.
Now I'm okay, now I'm equipped to protect myself and my family, right? What do you tell those people when it comes to training?
I would say that's the equivalent of going to like your first BJJ class, getting introduced to the concept of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, realizing like, okay, this is potentially a superpower, but it needs to be worked on, right? So like there could be a false sense of confidence with that for sure. And we see that on a regular basis, right? We get guys that come to a class like, hey, I just got this, just got that. Like I've been shooting for a little bit. And then you get the guys that are like, hey man, like I grew up shooting. Yeah. Like I grew up on a farm shooting my daddy's rifle. It's like, that dude couldn't hit water if he fell out of a boat, right? Like, so it's tough in that regard. But we know like, hey, like shooting is a perishable skill.
Yes.
The second you stop doing it, you kind of get worse at it, right? Doesn't develop. You need to be consistently or continuously refined and defined at points based on the specific intent, right? Like if you're looking to carry a firearm with the intent of using it in defense of human life to protect yourself or a third party, right, from the imminent use of death or physical injury. Like the reality is when it comes to that, it's a high stakes game. It's not a game at all, but it's a high stakes game. You're absolutely competing for points, so to say, right? You're competing for life. And what is good enough? Like you won't know until game day, so to say. You just won't know because who's the opposition? Did they get to go first, right? Like there's a myriad of factors that go into play with that, and you have to look at that on a case-by-case basis. But when we look at the consequences of failing, like it's life and death.
Yeah.
You know? It's life and death.
I think the problem is most of us are naive to those consequences, or we just watch a bunch of movies and we think we have,
Dude, Hollywood has ruined shooting.
Oh, I'm telling you.
Hollywood has not helped.
Let me tell you the big one, right?
Yeah.
John Wick. Freaking love John Wick. Love that movie, man. But it has ruined some
story.
people. Yeah.
Cool story, dude.
Yeah, exactly.
That's
exactly
about it.
Right. And so you were talking about the instructors at the academy. They knew a little something.
Yeah.
And they're enthusiastic about it.
Yeah.
Right. And maybe as you were going through it, did you have a whole lot of firearms experience before you went into the academy?
No, not
a
really.
whole lot. So you didn't know what you didn't know.
Nope.
Right. So
I was
you were
a
thinking
blank slate. So to say.
So you were thinking you were getting really good instruction, and then you got out of that. You got into your incident, and you're like, oh.
Dude, so just to paint the picture for you, our basic firearms instruction, right? Like day one, we're gonna teach center axis relock. Like we're gonna learn how to shoot car.
Really?
Like literally talking about John Wick, right?
Yeah.
Like, literally. So when I see that, it's like, that's a total joke. But anyway, those instructors got sold some snake oil, thought it was the best thing since sliced bread because whatever special operations team, wherever was doing that, and that was like the way. They bought into it. That dude made a lot of money on that contract, right? Taught it to the entire department, the entire region, rather. And now it's like, hey, you have SWAT dudes that are learning this. Like they're supposed to be the creme de la creme within those circles. And again, I'm not saying this as a ding. I'm not trying to knock dudes, but they didn't know enough to know what they don't, right? And they got sold some snake oil that gets passed down, trickled down to, the new dudes. So I mean, goodness, even our quals changed from like you didn't qual beyond like 7 yards, like beyond 10 yards.
Wow. Yeah.
Because the system sucks. Like you can't outside of contact distance, it has no purpose, and even then, it's not ideal for that. So anyway, nonetheless, to paint that picture, that was our basic firearms training: was center axis relock, car. Yeah.
Okay, so somebody coming into it off the street, kind of the way you did, with little to no experience behind firearms, how would you give them advice on how to vet their instructors?
Yeah. So if you just go off a resume, that's tough, right? Because guys can wax poetic about resumes, right? Like guys can be like, I'm an instructor in this, I'm certified in that, I've done this, I've been there, I have this patch, this pin, blah, 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 blah. I got this hat qual, right? Like we see that even in the training community where guys are like, I passed all these dudes quals at their classes, right? Like their hat qual or their pin qual or their patch qual or whatever the heck it is, their standards. And now it's like all of a sudden like they're it, right? And we know that's not the case. Shooting the shooting community has changed drastically within the past several years, right? Past 2 years specifically. Guys like Matt Pronka, Ben Stoger, Joel Parks, Chris Palmer, a lot of dudes, Mike Pannone, putting in serious work to have open discussions and dispel those misnomers. And bring light to practical shooting. My first interaction with practical shooting was, I was back at work. I had probably had about 14 years on the job at this point, and was working with a buddy of mine, and he had a training facility. He was a mill dude, still active, going back and forth. When he wasn't there, he was doing training. Opened up a training company back home, and would bring in law enforcement and run this was like before simunitions like really blew up. Wow. It was kind of like not really known of well within the law enforcement and civilian circles. So we were doing that, and he was like, "Hey man, like, can you go like open up the range for these dudes?" I'm like, hey, "Yeah, who is it?" He's like, "Oh, just a bunch of USPSA guys. Like they're gonna be running around and shooting targets or whatever." I'm like, gamers, right? Like the mentality was like, oh, gamers. So I'm like, okay, I'll watch these posers. Dude, when I got there, it's like completely unassuming dudes, right? Like your CPAs, your soccer dads, construction, like the gamut of like the professional community. Nobody there looked capable. Nobody there looked tough. Like they weren't overtly like who I would say I see him on the street and would be like, wow, I don't want to pick a fight with that dude.
Yeah.
Like they actually all looked kind of the opposite. And then when these guys start shooting, it was extremely fast. And they were moving like a lot. So I'm watching it, I'm like, that's a miss, that's a miss. I'm like, there's no way they're actually hitting anything, right? Putting my own limitations on what I was watching. And they're like 2 alpha, 2 alpha, 2 alpha, 2 alpha, 2 alpha, 2 alpha. I'm like, hold on. Obviously there's like, it must be the guns. Like they're running like these open format guns, blah, 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 blah. I'm like, let me try this. And the guy's like, no, well, you gotta be on practice score and you gotta do this and you gotta, I'm like, it doesn't have to count for anything. Can I just get a run? It's like at the end of the night, I just want to try this one thing. Like I want to see what my time and my accuracy, like my time would look like with accuracy, you know, in comparison.
Right.
Dude, those dudes, I didn't come close. They were shooting so fast and so accurately. I was extremely accurate, but I was slow, a day late and $1 short in that regard. And I was like, hey man, like, how are you guys doing this? And they're like, you just gotta jump on in and start doing this. And back then it was like work schedules. I was working 80 hours a week, your typical cop hours. Task force life and all that. It's just like, there's no way at that time where I was, didn't have it. And then like where I was like in the country, where I was living, it just wasn't like an open thing. It wasn't as prominent, as well known as it is now.
Right.
So I knew early on, like those guys are definitely onto something.
Yeah.
And I, early on I questioned it just like everybody else does from the tactical side of the house. Like, well, what does that look like in real life? I traveled the gamut of training under dudes. Like there's more dudes that I haven't, or there's more dudes that I, or I'd say less dudes that I haven't trained with than the dudes that I have.
Right.
Because I was like that young, like, hey, like I gotta go to this guy's class, I gotta go to that guy's class. Like this guy, he's accredited, let me go to his class. And it's like, I realized quickly that like standard law enforcement training does not cut the mustard at that point in time where I was. It was like, okay, I have to like look for training outside of these circles and start paying for it on my own and just, I gotta get better at this. Like these guys that are teaching this at the academy level or the instructor level at the department, they don't know what they don't know. And I was kind of in search for it.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that you brought up that I have never come across before is you broke down the definition of what shooting is. To me, I'm like, hey, look, you take this gun, you point it towards the target, you pull the trigger, and you hit it, right? I'm like, that's shooting. That's what I thought all day long. But your ability to break it down to something very digestible, we're talking about balancing that whole speed versus accuracy and all that kind of stuff. It was incredible, and it blew my mind. So I want you to touch on that.
Yeah, I mean, so where that came from is just, I think definitions are important. I think they matter, especially like when we're teaching. Like for instance, I said like, hey guys, I'm gonna teach you guys how to fight. Like if we don't define like the parameters of what this looks like and like the context with which, where we're gonna use it, you run into issues, right? Because I can ask a wrestler what a fight looks like and he's gonna have a different idea than what the Muay Thai boxer is gonna look like.
Correct.
And then like, the war fighter, like what his idea of a fight looks like is different than the soccer mom's fight.
Yeah.
So I think it's important that like whenever we're teaching anything, we take into consideration like who's the audience, who's the student body, like, and what are their goals and objectives, and then what's the intent behind the content, right? Like one of the things I always think is important to cover is like kind of like the universals. I always say like, hey, intent is always prior to content, not devoid of context. And then like the intent is just obviously denotes the why, like why am I making X content? The content could just be whatever content's in a class. So the intent is the why. The content is what I'm advocating for or trying to refute. And then also how, right? And then if we look at the context, that kind of denotes like who it's for, where it applies, and then when it applies. So when we look at that as a base, like as a whole formula, we just look at it and we see that it covers who, what, when, where, why, and how, which are kind of like those universals that I think are important to discuss prior to talking about any content. You know, like if we're going to teach, you know, for me at least, that's just what I find resonates well with me. It's how it's how I learn. Those are questions that I think about when I'm digesting content and trying to filter it through that lens. Like, hey, does this apply to me? How much of it applies to me? Maybe some of it does, maybe some of it doesn't. And then try to, you know, gather what's useful and then kind of just discard what's not.
Yeah.
But like when we talk about shooting, I mean, I've taken so many shooting classes, whether it was on the law enforcement side or just, you know, open enrollment stuff, or whether it's closed enrollment for law enforcement or whatever. A lot of dudes didn't really define, like, let's just talk about what shooting is. Like, if you ask the bullseye shooter, what is shooting? It's like, they are hyper focused on accuracy.
Right.
It's like you get the old, you know, the old adage of speed is fine, but accuracy is final, right? So it's like nobody cares how fast you miss. And that's true to an extent. And then on the flip side, it's like, hey, we're just shooting for combat accuracy, right? So we're just trying to get these rounds close enough, you know, like just close enough, but we want to be really fast. And we've seen what that looks like, right? Like they'll hose the target at, you know, 2 yards, a yard away. And it's like, nope, combat accurate, right? If they miss, it's like, see, that would have been a good, that shot down there, just ignore that guy. Like those are fine, that would have been in his pelvis. But they weren't intentional, right? They weren't intended to go that way. So I think it's important that we define, if we're gonna teach something, anything, we define what that looks like. When it comes to shooting, I simply define it as like the broad definition of, you know, the utilization of a firearm on an intended target with a specific point of aim, right? And then those projectiles are intended to hit that. But we have to take into consideration that there is a balance of both speed and accuracy. Like the fastest miss scores you 0 points. And the most accurate shot ever made, but made too late, also scores you 0 points. So when we look at that, we see that all shooting, whether it's tactical or practical, period, it all comes down to balancing those two things, you know, speed and accuracy. And then like, what is it actually balancing on? Like, what does it hinge on? You know, when can I wig out when can I step on the gas and go fast? And when do I need to kind of like throttle back, right? Switch gears and kind of be a little more refined with my vision, etc., my grip, or a little more refined with my trigger press to ensure that I get a hit on a more difficult target, right? So when we see that, we look at like the assumption of risk. So I would say that speed and accuracy really do hinge on one's assumption of risk, and that risk is relative or subjective to the individual shooter, right? Like, what may be a risky shot for you may not be for me, and vice versa. What I may consider super risky, you may be like, yeah, I can do that with my eyes closed. That's a gimme. But when we look at the universals, right, as far as like principally speaking, what we use to define or filter, you know, difficulty, always comes down to like the size of the target, this individual shooter's distance from it. Is there movement involved on the target side as well as on the shooter side? Is there movement involved, right? All those things start adding or subtracting from the difficulty. The clarity, right? Like, is the target obstructed? Is the specific point that I need to hit on this target obstructed, or is it just a wide open target, right? What's the clarity of the foreground? What's the clarity of the background? Most dudes are thinking about the background, but the foreground matters, right? Like if there's some good, like let's say there's 15 yards in between us, and this is at a venue where there's, you know, open space between us and people have the freedom to move in between, that's something that needs to be considered, the foreground, right? So clarity of the foreground, clarity of the background, and then taking into consideration like the consequences of a miss. And not just the consequences of like a missed shot, but also the consequence of a missed opportunity, right? So now I had the opportunity to shoot that shot, if you will, but for whatever reason, you know, I was reluctant, I was hesitant, I didn't take advantage of that opportunity, and now that opportunity is lost. What are the consequences of that lost opportunity, that missed opportunity? So I think when we look at balancing speed and accuracy, it falls under that assumption of risk, and we look at all those different factors, the risk factors, we look at it and we say, okay, those are the constants, right? Those variables are the constant that we find irrespective of whether it's a competitive shooting you know, stage or it's real world with, you know, super high consequences.
like I said, so good. I so appreciated that.
What I advocate for or against needs to be in support of that definition.
Well, David, I appreciate you coming out and hanging out with us. Tell us what you got going on. When's the next classes over here?
Yeah, man, we're doing more stuff this year with Achilles, really leaning into the Achilles side. They, like Rick and Paul, my other teammates there at Achilles Heel Tactical, really just trying to do more classes this year, trying to reach a broader audience, right? And just be able to teach at the different skill levels and just try to take shooters farther along in that journey. As we progress as coaches, like we're just trying to get better as ourselves at both the application as well as the inference of that information, that knowledge, the teaching, coaching side of it. Trying to think of new drills and new skills, different ways to present the material, to make it digestible and concise and articulate in our format, in our presentation of it. So we'll be doing more of that this year, diving deeper into that, doing more stuff on the combative side, bringing kind of a merger from like what I see with the anti shooting side, bringing in some integrated combative stuff and introducing that to the crowd. Because I think we really just need to make more well-rounded, interdisciplinary, and integration of all systems, if you will, right? Like everybody has their bias, right?
Right.
The wrestler likes to wrestle, the boxer likes to box, kind of thing. The jiu-jitsu guy likes to do jiu-jitsu. The shooter likes to shoot. The knife guy likes to, do knife stuff. It's like that's good, but like, what's a good practical approach across the board? Like, how do we dive deep into each of those individually, and then where do we strip away what's practical and applicable across the board, for kind of the generic end user, right? Like a system that works for, everyone from the soccer mom to, the crime fighter.
Yeah, absolutely. Man, that's awesome. Well, you guys can guarantee I'm gonna be there. So if you want to meet David and dive deeper into his skill sets and his knowledge base, I cannot recommend that enough. David?
Right on. Thank you, man. Appreciate it, bro.
Guys, Josh with Gritr here. This is David Acosta, and we'll see you next time.